Our first speaker this evening is Simon Shephard, who I've known for a number of years now, and who informed me the other day that he's in the course of his military career, he has worn 9 different cap badges, which should tell us something, I suppose. And Vic was one of those wonderful people who was a primary school teacher in BFES in Germany, at Derby School in Osnabrück for 5 years. And I think she must be, she can hate me for saying this, she must be the oldest subaltern the British Army has ever known. And I stand to be corrected because we're not going to reveal her age this evening. But nevertheless, they are here to deliver a talk which I really am looking forward to. And I will leave the stage now, let Simon put up the slides. When they finish their talk, I will come back to moderate a Q&A session. So with that, Simon, Vic, I'm leaving and I'll see you in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dudley.
Thanks, Dudley. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening, delivering what is actually our first ever attempt at a dual presentation. And it happens to be here with the Society Army Historical Research this evening. So thanks for having us.
Tonight's presentation, Gentlemen and Ladies of Character, is based on research that Vic and I have been undertaking since about 2022, when we first discussed writing a longitudinal history of commissioning in Britain's land forces. We took the starting point as being the establishment of the Standing Army in 1660, and we have focused on 3 core themes: the societal reason for seeking a commission in one of Britain's land forces, how the commission was obtained, and what, if any, training was delivered before an individual was given command of soldiers. Although our research remains a work in progress, it has become abundantly clear that one of, and perhaps the most important factor in selecting individuals to be officers in Britain's land forces, and which has been consistent over time, is their character. Tonight, we intend to explore this idea across the 365-year history of Britain's standing forces. Although we made mention of the definition of character in the synopsis for this presentation, we will start by taking a quick look at the dictionary definition. Vic will then look at how and where the concept of character sits within current British Army leadership doctrine. We will then discuss the wording of a commission, and using the military technique of mission analysis, we'll identify the tasks it lays upon an individual and how their character plays a part in achieving them. Thereafter, we will take it in turns to cover the 4 eras you can see on the screen, which we have broadly grouped to cover the importance of position, patronage and purchase, the rise of public schools and an increasing interest in professionalism, Britain's land forces during the era of mass, and finally a return to an all-professional army after the ending of national service. After this, we will draw some conclusions and then take some questions. So let us start by defining character. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it to be qualities, differences, strengths, originality, and reputation. Yet all of these terms are subjective and very much open to interpretation, or it is now referred to unconscious bias of the observer. During most HR selection processes, organisations are invariably looking for an individual who will be a good fit. For many, it is not the qualities that make a person different or original, but those that will make them the same, which are being sought. It would also be logical to assume that all organisations seek to employ someone who has a good reputation. To set the requirement of character in context of a military environment, let us look at what Lord Moran said in his work, The Anatomy of Courage. I contend that fortitude in war is but one more test, the supreme and final test, if you will, of character. He cannot be selfish in peace, yet be unselfish in war. Character, as Aristotle taught, is a habit, the daily choice of right and wrong. It is a moral quality which grows to maturity in peace and is not suddenly developed on the outbreak of war. For war, in spite of what we have heard to the contrary, has no power to transform. It merely exaggerates the good and evil that are in us all, till it is plain for all to read. It cannot change, it exposes. So armed with the OED definition and Lord Moran's thoughts, I will hand you over to Vic to take us through the relatively recent concept of leadership doctrine.
We're becoming more adept as a society at codifying expectations of our service personnel, where they sit in our society and what they can expect in return for their service. And this has been visibly improving for over the last 25 years. The next two slides show the key documents relating to the recent developments in leadership theory in the British Army. The first to be produced was Soldiering the Military Covenant 2000, which discussed the character of the Army as an institution, its covenant with society, duty of care, and moral obligation. In doing so, it identified that officers were expected to display strength of character in balancing authority, duty of care, and ethical decision-making, whilst it emphasised that without strong character, leadership risks becoming authoritarian or self-serving. These ideas were further underpinned when the government included the Armed Forces Covenant. They are now codified and can be found in the Army's values and standards, which form the moral foundation of the character needed to serve in the Army, regardless of one's rank. The Army has defined the components of character as integrity, discipline, courage, loyalty, respect for others, and selfless commitment, all of which, in this context, help to shape an individual's military identity. Our values and standards epitomise the concept that the character of an individual is reflected in their behaviour and thus impacts on the trust and faith placed in them by their followers and the legitimacy they have as a leader. So sorry, Simon, could you possibly mute your microphone? Thank you. Character has been privileged as one of the three pillars of leadership alongside knowledge and action. And officer development emphasises that failure in character equates to failure in leadership, thus making character and its development a non-negotiable criterion in assessment and training. These documents identify that character provides the moral legitimacy of and for command decisions and is essential in maintaining trust between leaders, their subordinates, and the wider society. Although it could be argued that character is far more holistic, the leadership competency framework enables an individual's character to be explicitly measured against such competencies as lawful behaviour, respect, and moral courage. In 2024, the Centre for Army Leadership produced Putting the Heart into Character. This explores definitions of character as the ethical and moral foundation of behaviour. Quoting West Point, it reinforces the notion that if you fail in character, you are failing in leadership. From these modern documents, it is clear that the Army, unsurprisingly, sees character as playing a vital part in an individual's ability to lead. But as many in the audience will know, the British Army came relatively late to the concept of doctrine as a whole, let alone specifically for leadership. So where historically was the requirement for an individual to have character, particularly as an officer, ever laid down?
If you gather a group of officer cadets together at Sandhurst, as I have, and ask them what is meant by the term commission, they will undoubtedly explain that for them it is the act of becoming an officer, marching up the steps of Old College. For them it is now a verb, a doing word, for they are at Sandhurst and are undertaking the training to commission. If you ask them what a commission says, the vast majority, if not all, will look at you blankly. Whilst if you ask them what Sandhurst teaches them about the commission, they will invariably reply with serve to lead, which of course is both the motto of Sandhurst and by an extension, the motto of the Army Officers Corps as well. It is of course the Army's current philosophical approach to leadership, yet this specific phrase is not found in the commissioning scroll. Yet the words of an officer's commission set out the roles and responsibilities that when granting a commission, their sovereign expects of them. It is, in modern parlance, the ultimate job specification. Historically, the granting of commissions went far beyond the army, but during the English Civil War, they were issued in great numbers to officers on both sides. On the screen is a copy of one of the oldest known surviving commissions from the English Civil War. As you can see, it grants a captaincy to Thomas Ells in General Fleetwood's Regiment of Horse. I do not intend to attempt to read Old English, and therefore I will give you a few seconds to read it for yourself. You will also find that the 3 commissions that I put up are in the handouts that Dudley has made available to you. The commissioning scroll, originally a parchment, is a profound and dignified document, issued under royal signature, as is the case with this one from Charles II, to those officers who have earned the privilege of serving as commissioned officers. On the screen is the wording of a Charles II commission for a new ensign, in this case Roland Morgan. It dates from 1663 and is found in the record books held in the National Archives. Although shorter than the previous commission, as you read it, you will be able to pick out the similarities relating to discipline, orders, and trust with that of the parliamentary commissions from the English Civil War. Again, I will give you a few seconds to read it. Moving now to the current King Charles III Commission. It is clearly longer than the previous ones. This is predominantly due to them now being issued as a commission for life, rather than as a commission by rank. As such, it highlights that promotions, etc., relating to this commission will be published in the London Gazette. But beyond this, when reading it, you will see that the wording remains remarkably consistent with the Charles II Commission you just saw or have downloaded. Again, I will give you a few seconds to read this one on the screen. When studied in detail, all of these commissioning scrolls are, as you will have seen, strikingly similar, setting out as they do the roles and responsibilities, as well as the expected allegiances of the recipient.
Using the modern day technique of mission analysis as a lens through which to look at all 3 commissions, it is possible to draw out both the explicit and the implied responsibilities which fall to the holder. At their core, the wording of all 3 commissions articulates their primary mission, to formally bestow the authority to lead. In this respect, they have been and remain both a legal and a symbolic instrument, conferring command responsibility over others, whilst affirming an officer's allegiance to the Crown. A commission gives the recipient the privilege to serve as a leader while setting obligations that they must meet whilst also leading. In doing so, it sets the foundation for a leadership role that has always been defined by the concepts of trust, personal example, and professional excellence. These fundamental requirements are central to the Commission's intent. For the newly commissioned officer, the requirement to command is not abstract, it is both immediate and very personal. It inevitably requires a deep moral responsibility to make decisions in the best interests of one's soldiers, the mission, and the Army's reputation. Within the wording of the Commission, several duties are made explicit. As well as the obligation to lead and command soldiers, the Commission also charges officers with upholding the values and the standards by which all, from the newest subaltern to the Chief of the General Staff, are expected to lead. Beyond the explicit wording, the Commission implies several critical expectations. One is the demand for moral and, in the modern era, ethical leadership, with cognizance that the newly commissioned officer is not merely a tactical operator, but a guardian of justice and fairness. They must lead with consistency and a strong sense of right and wrong as key role models, especially when under pressure. In addition, although it does not list combat skills, It requires that officers are capable of leading in battle. The Commission also implies a requirement for intellectual agility because it's taken for granted that officers must be able to think critically, adapt swiftly, and make informed decisions under duress. This intellectual pre-standard is particularly relevant to the complexity of modern operations, where decisions often involve a delicate blend of military, political, legal, and ethical considerations. Equally important is the implied responsibility to train, mentor, and care for subordinates. This developmental role is particularly vital at the lowest levels, where leadership is personal and constant. Implicitly, the Commission alludes to the indefinable elements of character, the internal compass, presence, and resilience that sets leaders apart. While never stated outright, it is woven into every line. Officers are expected to have a quality that traditionally has not been measured, an innate strength that inspires confidence, steadies others in crisis, and commands without coercion. By implication, to be granted a commission, the chosen person must be an individual of character.
Now that we understand a little more of the makeup of the ultimate officer's job spec and the place of character within it, let us now trace its role in helping to select officers. When Parliament permitted James II to maintain a standing army, it was not created from scratch, but rather came into existence using elements from the remaining forces of Parliament and the Crown. They, in turn, looked to traditions and concepts of leadership which long predated the English Civil War. From the late Middle Ages, military commissions were dominated by the nobility and landed gentry, but only used as and when England was threatened. Military leadership was not necessarily a matter of skill, but an expression of social order. Gentlemen were assumed to possess the natural virtues of courage, loyalty, and honour. In short, character. To be of gentle birth was to be imbued with the qualities necessary for command. Yeomen who rose to lesser leadership positions did so only because they could equip themselves and demonstrate financial independence. But their suitability was always considered conditional and exceptional rather than natural. The English Civil Wars disrupted this long-standing assumption. Royalist officers were still drawn overwhelmingly from the nobility and gentry, reinforcing the belief that birthright equaled character. But Parliament's armies introduced a radical experiment. Cromwell, in particular, insisted that what mattered was not whether a man was a gentleman that will be damned, but whether he knew what he fought for. Here, character was recast as moral conviction and godliness. And in this framework, artisans, merchants, and even cobblers could be judged fit to hold a commission. The new model army institutionalized this shift. About 15% of its officers were promoted from the ranks, their authority grounded in demonstrated discipline, piety, and reliability. However, the gentry, made up of men such as Colonel Nathan Fiennes, son of the Lord Say and Seal, took up arms for Parliament as well. Yet this revolution in thinking about character was precarious. While Parliament temporarily recognised that commoners could show the integrity and virtue demanded of officers, this recognition came only under the extraordinary pressure of civil war. More often, gentlemen were still presumed to have character by birthright, while commoners had to prove it in ways that were exceptional, costly, and frequently resented. The 1640s thus represent a rupture and a continuity, a brief moment where character was defined by inner conviction rather than social status, but one that did not fully overturn the deeper belief that true leadership belonged naturally to the gentry. Let us now look at our first era when one's family position in society and their ability to fund the purchase of a commission were almost all important, although a fundamental requirement to obtaining a commission was also patronage.
The Restoration reasserted with force the idea that true character belonged only to the aristocracy and gentry. Commissions were almost exclusively the preserve of these cohorts. The officer corps was remade as a reflection of elite society. To hold a commission was to mark oneself as a man of birth and breeding. It was proof of one's gentlemanly identity. By the late 17th century, the purchase system entrenched this view. The ability to buy a commission was framed not only as evidence of wealth, but as confirmation of gentlemanly trustworthiness. Only those of substantial means could be trusted with the lives of soldiers, the Crown's authority, and the responsibilities of command. In this system, money was not merely financial capital, it was treated as a marker of social and moral worth. The assumption was that a man with land and wealth had the independence, honour, and a good character that qualified him to lead. Education played strongly into this narrative as well. A young gentleman might be schooled in the classics, riding or fencing, but such accomplishments were less about technical ability than about cultivating the polish and manners expected of a leader. Character was presumed to reside in his social station. Training simply refined what was already natural. By contrast, when a common-born man showed bravery or skill, this was explained as accidental or mechanical somehow, not as evidence of true character. Thus, while artisans or professionals might be tolerated in specialist roles like engineering and gunnery, they were rarely admitted to line commissions. Those remained absolutely the province of men of character, which meant men of status and money. Patronage reinforced these assumptions. Colonels often staffed their regiments with family members and friends of equal social rank. Nepotism was not seen as corrupt, but as proof of maintaining a trustworthy circle of men whose honour was guaranteed by birth. In effect, character was equated with social class, and social class was safeguarded by wealth, patronage, and the purchase system. By the early 18th century, the officer corps had become almost entirely synonymous with nobility and landed gentry. Commissions served both as a reward for birth and a mechanism to exclude others. Character was assumed to flow naturally from lineage, with commoners dismissed as incapable of embodying the virtues of honour, loyalty, and leadership. Yet there was actually no guarantee of gentlemanly conduct amongst the officers of the time. Duelling, both with their peers and against civilians, was quite common. Excessive leave was taken, poor standards were set, limited attention was actually paid to professionalism, whilst it was not also uncommon for junior officers of high social standing to ignore their seniors if they felt themselves to be of superior birth. Some men were even allowed to purchase a commission, despite coming from the lowest levels of society. Money was often the driving force in such decisions. Thus, Swift Nicks, a pardoned highwayman, purchased his commission as a captain from the soldier and poet William Wycherley. In the mid-18th century, commissioning into the British Army remained dominated by wealth and social connection, but character was still wrapped in the language of gentlemanly conduct. Officers were expected to embody loyalty, courage, and manners, but the concept of character was still understood as an inheritance of class. Commissions were routinely bought. Purchase was defended on the grounds that it prevented men of low birth from gaining influence and tied officers financially to their regiment, a form of vested interest in good behaviour. But in reality, it meant that commissions were simply monopolised by the wealthy. When character was invoked, it was verbal shorthand for birth and connections. The idea that a yeoman farmer's son or a sergeant could possess the same moral fibre was simply dismissed as nonsensical. This exclusion illustrates the aristocratic belief that virtue flowed from lineage, not individual merit. Trooper Thomas Brown of the 3rd Dragoons at Dettingen exemplifies this. The king granted commissions at that time to troopers from the lifeguards almost exclusively made up of gentlemen for their service on that day. However, Brown, who was a commoner who had been severely wounded saving his regimental standard, was made a knight bachelor, awarded a pension of £30 a year, which wasn't an insubstantial sum at the time, and granted the position of gentleman in the lifeguards, but he did not receive a commission. By this point, there were stirrings of interest in education, particularly in artillery and engineering, where scientific knowledge was just indispensable. The Royal Military Academy at Woolwich was founded in 1741 for technical corps, and that introduced a merit-based element, but in truth, it did remain dominated by patronage. But this exception actually then proved the rule. Purchase still dominated line regiments, and entry to Woolwich itself actually still required money and backing. Thus, while character remained the rhetoric of selection, it was effectively synonymous with social standing and financial capacity. Commoners could display courage, but they lack the polish and connection synonymous with being gentlemen, and so were consequently judged wanting. The Napoleonic period saw both continuity and disruption. The Napoleonic Wars demanded more officers than were required in peacetime, obviously, thus promotions from the ranks did occur, fueling the romanticised sharp notions that we've heard of throughout the years. In reality, such cases were rare and were steeped in prejudice. However, by the end of the period, nearly 80% of new commissions had been granted without purchase. When the pages of the London Gazette for that time are analysed, those new commissions were invariably given to men described as gents, thus by implication men of good character. The founding of the Royal Military College at Marlow in 1802, which did later become Sandhurst, signalled the intent to provide basic education for those seeking a commission, albeit at the very lowest levels. But officers from the Royal Military College remained a minority, and most officers still entered by purchase. Those entering the RMC as gentlemen cadets were assumed to have character simply by virtue of their social standing. Money and connections still opened the door. Character provided the justification. Education was creeping into discourse, but access to education itself at that time required money. Thus, wealth underpinned both routes, purchase and education. This period epitomizes the paradox. The army, reflecting society, claimed to prize gentlemanly character, yet it was money that defined who could possibly be said to have it. As peace returned to Europe, Britain once more turned her gaze to her empire, where it would remain firmly focused for the remainder of the century. At home, education would become more centralised to British life, driven by improvements in public schools and the widening of access for children of the less fortunate.
After Waterloo, the army shrank dramatically, and Wellington's conservatism dominated officer policy. He resisted reform and maintained that the officer corps should be drawn from gentlemen. His supposed remark about Waterloo being won on the playing fields of Eton epitomises the belief that public schools instilled character. In practice, public schools were brutal, emphasising toughness, stoicism and hierarchy, traits coded as the essence of officer character. He openly distrusted the character of men risen from the ranks. In 1832, when questioned about whether sergeants should receive commissions, he argued that they lacked the refinement of gentlemen, famously caricaturing them as unable to handle fine wine and porter. Instead, they preferred gin and ale. Here, character was weaponized to exclude working-class men, reducing it to a code for class identity rather than virtue. Whilst the RMA Woolwich continued to focus on military science and technical competencies, journals like the United Service Gazette called for reform of infantry and cavalry commissions. However, admission to the RMC required financial and social capital, ensuring only the well-off could benefit. By mid-century, schools like Harrow, Eton and Cheltenham began advertising their ability to produce Christian gentlemen, suited for the army. Education was explicitly framed as the cultivation of character. Thus, while intellect and professional study gained traction, they were always wrapped in the moral language that conflated class and virtue. Sergeants and others from below continued to be seen as lacking refinement. Even when talented, their character was discounted. Out with the requirement to fill quartermasters, riding masters and adjutants posts, men from the ranks had little opportunity for advancement, acts of valour on the battlefield being their only other route. This period represents a tension between two logics: the tradition, where character equals class equals wealth, defended by Wellington, or the professional, where education and science mattered, but access to it still required wealth. The result was that the army, and indeed wider society's concepts of character, became more institutionalised through public school education, and thus still inaccessible to commoners. Money and social status remained prerequisites for any route into officering. The Crimea War shattered the assumption that gentlemen by birth automatically made competent leaders. Military disasters and the scandals exposed the failures of officers who had secured commissions by purchase and patronage. For the first time in a sustained way, Parliament and public opinion pushed for change, demanding competence rather than just aristocratic polish. Yet reforms were piecemeal. During the war, as normal, more commissions than usual went without purchase, and more NCOs were promoted for battlefield gallantry. But these remained the exceptions. As soon as peace returned, the officer corps tightened back its old patterns. The default assumption was still that men of high birth and wealth inherently possessed character, while commoners might display courage, but that lacked the manners to command. Throughout this period, the RMC continued to serve as a finishing school for gentlemen cadets, but its limited throughput meant purchase still dominated infantry and cavalry commissions. Thus, this era marks a hybrid stage. On the one hand, professionalism begins, and character is tentatively tied to discipline, diligence, and education. On the other, gentlemanly ideas remain dominant, with wealth and school background ensuring the officer corps continued to be the preserve of the upper and middle classes. Carr's abolition of in 1871 of purchase was heralded as a revolution. In principle, commissions would now be won through competitive examinations and education, not through checkbooks. The system shifted but did not transform. The exam system rewarded exactly the kind of schooling offered by elite public schools, and success still required extensive tuition and for many families additional expenditure on crammers so that their sons might pass. The landed gentry continued to lose ground to the middle and upper middle classes as the backbone of the officer corps. Character in this era was formally redefined as something produced by education, especially at public schools. Courage, stoicism, loyalty, and self-control were recast as the products of boarding school culture, team games, rigid discipline, Christian moralizing, rather than the birthright of aristocracy. Sandhurst, offering a finishing layer, provided drill, riding, and administration, while Woolwich professionalised the artillery and engineers. But despite the rhetoric of meritocracy, the cost of schooling and the fees for the RMA and RMC meant that the system was still socially exclusive. The abolition of purchase did not democratise access. It merely shifted the currency of commissioning from cash to education. In effect, education became the new form of purchase, with character assumed to have been formed in the classrooms and playing fields of the great public schools. Men from the ranks could still be commissioned into their traditional roles, or on the battlefield, but the appointment of adjutant was lost, as men commissioned from Sandhurst sought to serve at the right hand of their commanding officers and be schooled by them. The most notable exception to this was Sergeant Major William Robertson. Although his initial attempt to commission from the ranks was barred by an unsupported CO, 2 COs and 2 educational exams later, he was provisionally accepted for commissioning. But there was no public money left to pay for his uniform grant that year, so he waited before passing the final hurdle, an interview board of officers from another regiment to confirm his suitability, i.e. character, to be an officer. Robertson would of course go on to be Chief of the Imperial General Staff for much of the First World War, a feat sadly not possible for those commissioned directly from the ranks today. The Boer War exposed failings similar to the Crimea: poor leadership, tactics, ineptitude, and a complacent officer corps. This sparked inquiries and reform commissions that interrogated Sandhurst and Woolwich, calling for more tactical training and higher professional standards. Once again, war revealed the fragility of equating social polish with military competency. Yet even here, the cultural idea of character remained anchored in the public schools. Officer cadets at Sandhurst were assumed to have their character already formed before entry: courage, honour, loyalty, leaving the academy to polish military schools. The Ackers-Douglas Committee insisted that commandants of the RMA and RMC certify not only the competency, but also a gentleman's cadet's fitness to hold a commission, effectively a guarantee of his character. The Boer War also made clear that backdoor routes persisted. Routes from the militia, university cadet force, and wartime expedients allowed some outsiders in. But the social shape of the officer corps remained overwhelmingly middle and upper class. Character was still equated with educational background and manners, even as the professional training gained ground. With the full support of the Headmasters' Conference and the Army, Haldane created the senior and junior divisions of the Officer Training Corps. This produced a reserve of public school and university-educated young men with some basic military experience, ready to commission in time of war. This further embedded the role of these institutions as the gatekeepers of character and leadership for the Army, as they continued to provide a steady stream of young men already shaped into the required mould, disciplined, athletic, and imbued with the ethos of service. Character was assumed to be formed in youth, especially through team games and the prefect system. The events of July 1914 and Britain's reaction to them heralded an era of mass. This new requirement for a massed army would in time cause a seismic, albeit temporary, change in the construction of Britain's officer corps.
Initially, commissions went to those of character and standing. Overwhelmingly, these were public schools and university men. Haldane's reforms proved their worth, with significant numbers of those stepping forward having previously served in the OTC. They were joined in droves by men from across the middle-class professions. These included men known as clerks, then a solidly male middle-class profession, and were found in the Civil Service Rifles, one of Kitchener's new army battalions. The University and Public Schools Brigade seemed to form and train itself without officers, so keen were they to serve. The background of every man within it meant they were imbued with the character of a gentleman, and nearly all had been in the OTC. But it was not until some days after Kitchener had actually seen the brigade, accepted it for service, and it had already been billeted some 3,200 members in Epsom, that officers were even appointed. It was an effective fighting formation, but it contained many men who could easily have been commissioned if they had been prepared to wait. However, they preferred to fight and often die together as private soldiers, so keen were they to show both their loyalty to the Empire and also their physical courage. Some regiments, notably the Honorary Artillery Company, the Artist Rifles, and the Inns of Court, established battalions focused on training and developing future officers. 5,000 men applied to join the Artists Officer Training Battalion, of which only 1,000 were accepted. Yet the Artists, just like the other socially elite regiments, sent a battalion to war. Meeting them on the road to Ypres, Field Marshal French directed that 50, mostly former OTC men, be given a short talk by the CO on character and qualities of an officer, after which French had them immediately commissioned as temporary second lieutenants in the regular battalions of the 7th Division. However, by 1916, as casualties mounted, Britain literally ran out of men of character in the old sense. All that was available was the annual outturn of 18-year-olds from the public schools, yet there remained a pressing need for more and more officers. At this time, men of proven leadership ability, but often with limited education and certainly very little in the way of social standing, were sent back from the front to be trained as officers. They would enter the emerging officer cadet battalions, where their experience would rival inherited and educated character as a commissioning criteria. Joining them in the OCBs were the raw 18-year-old public school boys and men of professional classes who either finally felt the need to do their bit or were combed out of their professions as previous exemptions were rescinded in the drive to meet the need for more junior officers. Together they formed a rich melting pot where the social standing, character and education of some would rub shoulders with working class men of proven leadership. It was a two-way process between these two very different cohorts. The battle-hardened, proven military leaders adding their experience to the formal military training, whilst the public school educated helped their new comrades understand the social graces of the mess and the finer points of character expected of them as officers. As the country ran out of manpower, it turned to women to help make up the shortfall, and a new organisation was required. The Women's Auxiliary Army Corps was relatively small in numbers. This meant that the officers it needed could easily be found from the wives and offspring of the upper and middle classes, whose superior social standing meant that they were presumed to be of the right character to lead. Sandhurst continued throughout the war to train officers for regular commissions, with its gentlemen cadets inevitably joining their regiment's regular battalions, as it was extremely rare for an OCB commissioned temporary officer to be allowed to serve in a regular battalion. With peace restored, the army reverted, commissions once again clustered amongst the public school elite. The brief wartime meritocracy closed and character was re-embedded in social status. Both Woolwich and Sandhurst had suspended fees during the war, but these were quickly reintroduced to help defer costs. At the same time, the regular army was only too happy to divest itself of its temporary officers, thereby enabling it to return to the pre-war notion that men suitable for commissioning needed to have been educated preferably at a fee-paying public school, where they would have developed the necessary character to lead. One of the most widely recognised traditions of the commissioning parade at Sandhurst actually started in 1926, when the college adjutant at the time, Captain Frederick Boy Browning DSO, decided to ride his charger, the Vicar, up the steps of Old College before dismounting inside. To this day, no one knows why he did it. An impulse, demonstration of physical courage, or horsemanship, who knows? Or perhaps it was simply just in his nature, an element of his character, to do something extraordinarily different. Whatever it was, every adjutant since that day has followed Boy Browning's lead. Whilst there were some attempts to broaden the base of the officer corps and widen opportunities, with Sandhurst finally allowing NCOs to attend its courses, these were very few in number. For most of the interwar period, the army looked for its future officers to be socially affable, content to serve in the northwest frontier or other far-flung parts of the empire, happy to join and enjoy life in the mess, play polo or go on safari if required, or even to engage in odd punitive expeditions against a poorly armed local tribe, all of which were obviously bound up in a man's character, which were of course still being formed on the army's behalf in the public schools. With the advent of the Second World War, again, the army needed to expand, and rapidly. In preparation, commissions were offered to middle-class men with technical skills and managerial experience, only to be activated on the outbreak of hostilities. Yet for the infantry and the cavalry, the main source of its future officers would remain the OTCs. Men seeking a commission were selected by a panel interview. These were short and sharp. Where had you been to school? Who was your father? Who did he know? And thus the historic criteria of position, purchase, albeit in education, and patronage, wrapped in the vernacular of character, still played a significant role. In one instance, a boy from an Aberdonian grammar school, lacking social background and influence, actually passed based on a demonstration of physical courage. He had just climbed a new route in the Scottish mountains, previously thought of as unachievable. Fortunately for him, the president of his board was a fellow mountaineer. Thus, with the connection made and moral fibre proven, he was deemed to have the right character to be an officer. Just as in the First World War, this system could not produce enough men suitable for commissioning, however. With only limited forces deployed in the Middle and Far East, the ability to identify leadership potential on the battlefield was also greatly reduced. A new approach was needed. As a result, the Army introduced the War Office Selection Boards, or WOSBs. All men coming were screened on call-up for the intellectual capacity to be trained as leaders. Those found to have it were sent to a WOSB, where they were subjected to psychological testing, individual and group problem solving, and interviews to identify leadership potential. But interviews still often turned on whether an officer recognised a candidate's school or family, whilst a candidate's character was assessed via observed performance in group discussion and during such activities as the individual assault course, where physical ability and sometimes courage could be found wanting. The system was half scientific, half old boy network. Men whose character was felt to be immature were sent to the Highland Fieldcraft Training Centre, where Lord Rowan put them through a series of activities to help their personal development before they were sent back for a second try at passing the WOSB. Ladies who wished to be officers were also put through a WOSB process, albeit in female-only groups. With the ending of the Second World War, the government of the day was determined that the social makeup of the Army's officer corps needed to be changed. They wanted to see more grammar school boys and more young men from the north in its ranks. Woolwich was closed and Sandhurst reopened as the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1947, only this time there was to be no fees. Whether it liked these ideas or not, the truth was that the army had no option but to accept them. In the immediate post-war period, it needed to maintain sufficient troops to occupy Germany, face down an increasing threat from the USSR, whilst having enough left over to stabilise the empire before conducting a gradual withdrawal. This necessitated the need for national service, which lasted until 1960. Men seeking a national service commission would attend one of the 5 remaining WASBs, undergo basic training with their future arm or corps before attending either Eton Hall or Mons Officer Cadet School. Those for Sandhurst attended the regular commissions board, which by then was based in Westbury. However, if a man who had passed the WASB, had completed his officer training and therefore held a national service commission, decided he enjoyed army life and wanted to be a regular, he would then be required to attend and pass an RCB before starting the entire process again by joining day 1 of the next RMAS intake. Given that both the WASBs and RCBs used the same testing regimes, which he'd already passed, it can only be assumed that this was to enable a subjective judgment to be made on his suitability, namely his character, to be a regular officer. In the mid-1950s, the Army also opened its own sixth form college, Welbeck, aimed at increasing the flow of non-public school educated young men into the officer corps. The fact that it based its curriculum and value-added polish on a boarding school system seems to have been entirely overlooked. With the ending of national service, the Army would gradually see its ability to fight at mass dwindle away, until it was smaller than any time since the Napoleonic Wars. In some respects, this reduction has, as we shall see, allowed the Army to revert to its natural officer recruiting grounds, the public schools. Unmute yourself, Simon.
Westbury continued to refine the process developed over the previous 2 decades. In doing so, it maintained a broad range of objectives and subjective assessment criteria, not least of which was character. Others seeking specialist commissions such as doctors and nurses, known as professionally qualified officers or PQOs, were assessed by members of their own CAP badge. Some used standard interviews, others used their own version of the Westbury assessments. Likewise, those seeking commissions in the Territorial Army were selected by regional versions of the RCB run under the auspices of local divisional or district headquarters. In the late 1970s, the Army felt that too many immature men were commissioning from the relatively new 6-month course at Sandhurst. As a way of maintaining both quality and numbers, a pre-course was formed to be known as Royal and Company. The primary focus of its 12-week course was to develop the leadership potential of those who attended, mainly by working on character development. Many of its methods left much to be desired, and the best that can be said is that they were of their time. For the public school boys, Sandhurst remained very much an extension of their previous 10 years of life, boarding, eating together, and conducting a range of educational, albeit military-focused, physical and sporting activities. They were increasingly joined at Sandhurst by young men who had served in the ranks. In 1981, the Women's Royal Army Corps officer training establishment came under command of Sandhurst and became its 4th college. And by 1984, the WRAC cadets were fully integrated into the training program. By the end of the Cold War, RCB no longer ran separate woman-only assessments, but now integrated the young men and women into mixed groups. Although no more than 2 females per group of 8 were permitted, it being felt that in many cases their wider experience of life, greater determination to seek a commission, and strength of character would skew the group dynamics, given that the rest of the cohort were invariably be 18-year-old public school boys with often very limited exposure to girls. This approach would persist until the late 20-teens. In September 1992, the new Common Commissioning course formed up. No longer were there separate courses for graduates, the SGC, public school boys and ex-soldiers, the SMC, or women, regardless of educational background. Now all were brought together at company level, although the female officer cadets were trained in separate platoons within the company. As the Army increasingly sought to recruit graduates, this new training regime was similar, but not yet the same as those found in the UOTCs, where male and female officer cadets had for a long time undertaken fully integrated training activities. In the early 2000s, RCB became the Army Officer Selection Board, or AOSB, where all regular and reserve candidates, as well as those seeking professionally qualified commissions, attending. Despite the drive to accept more university graduates, this did not necessarily widen the Army's social base. Many who had accepted from a university had previously attended a public school. Westbury continued to assess an individual's character, but one of the results of changing age dynamics was that it became increasingly hard for an 18-year-old to have the strength of character to hold their own in discussions or when undertaking tasks when surrounded by university graduates with who were some 3 to 5 years older than they were. Those that were able to do so invariably came from public schools, where a premium was still able to be placed on the development of the whole individual rather than focusing on academic league tables. In 2015, recognizing both changes in society and the way the Army had been required to operate in the previous 15 years, full integration of training was carried out at Sandhurst, and now men and women are found in the same platoon. In this final period, Sandhurst introduced the assessment of an individual's character as part of their suitability to hold a commission. At last, it was no longer simply sufficient to be able to conduct a command appointment to gain a commission. Now an officer cadet had to also have the character to be able to command 30 soldiers. The assessment regime at Westbury is based on a behavioural anchored rating score, which is applied to 3 domains: intelligence, physical ability, and personality. Within each of these, there are a number of subcategories. In all but one of these subcategories, candidates have to prove their ability and are scored from 0 to 9, depending on their assessed or observed performance. However, before attempting to assess character, the candidate is given a score of 5, as it is assumed that on arrival, all candidates had some form of character made up by varying degrees of loyalty, honesty, resilience, self-discipline, courage, and motivation. This is then assessed by both observed performance and through interviews at Westbury, as well as from evidence provided to support their application, such as written reports and testimonials from others. These assessments are then used to move their scores up or down against the BAR's criteria. In this way, a score for character is reached. As might be expected, COVID had a significant role to play in the selection of the officers of all 3 services. Whilst the Royal Navy elected to select their future officers via online interviews, Westbury closed for 3 months, during which it reset itself to enable socially distant assessments to be carried out. For the Army, it was unthinkable that it could select its future officers simply through a combination of interviews and cognitive testing. For the essence of Army leadership remains and our individual's character. There remains, though, a salutary warning. Notwithstanding the strides made by the Army to broaden its officer base and the finding those with the potential character needed to be second lieutenants from across the whole society, the development or polishing of character, which seems such a necessary primer, continues to be applied by the public schools, which make up just 7% of the total number of secondary education establishments in this country. Other educational institutions might try to do this, but they invariably lack the time or the resources. Therefore, it is perhaps not surprising that over the last 65 years, the percentage of young men and women who have been selected by Westbury and trained at Sandhurst and have been educated via a public school consistently hovers around the 45% mark. The difficulty is that the qualities that make up character are treated in part as observable and as a result remain subjective. Unconscious bias towards assumptions about class, upbringing, and the value-added polish a candidate may have received before applying are ever present, and as a result, this is guarded against by the staff at Westbury, and the utmost care is taken when assessing this particular dimension. The Army as we know it is steeped in tradition, with successive generations of many families serving as officers. You may recall that we met Nathaniel Fimes serving as a colonel for Parliament. Here we see a relative, Ned Fimes, in week 1 of the January 2025 intake at RMS, following in his footsteps. In the 17th and 18th century, Ned would have been granted a commission by virtue of his place in society as the son of the 22nd Lord Say and Seal. This fact alone would have been indicated his innate position that he innately possessed the character to be an officer. By the latter half of the 19th century and early 20th centuries, his attendance at a public school would have assured him his commission. He would, after all, have been schooled in all the elements of gentlemanly character an officer needed before he entered Sandhurst. Now, as well as proving his intellectual and physical abilities as a candidate at Westbury, Ned has also demonstrated that he has the character necessary to undergo officer training. At Sandhurst, he will be required to prove that he has the character, as identified in the Army Leadership Framework, necessary to lead 30 soldiers, both in peace and war.
How his children or grandchildren might be assessed for their suitability to be officers in Britain's land forces is as yet unclear. However, if Lord Moran was correct, then such assessments will need to include an individual's character, for war has no power to transform. It merely exaggerates the good and the evil that are in us all. Till it's plain for us all to read, it cannot change, it exposes. That concludes tonight's presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Before we take questions, we would just like to highlight that tonight's presentation has been drawn from information we have gathered for our 2-volume work on commissioning in Britain's land forces from 1660 to 2027, entitled The Steps to Glory. This will be published by Hellion, with Volume 1 due for release next year and Volume 2 in the summer of 2027, which, by coincidence, is the 225th anniversary of the founding of the Junior Department of the RMC, but perhaps more importantly, the 80th anniversary of the establishment of RMAS. CGS General Sir Rowley Walker has kindly agreed to write the foreword to Volume 1, whilst Major General Nick Cowley, the current Commandant, has agreed to do the same for Volume 2. We're still looking for personal input into our research for Volume 2 by gathering the recollections of those who have commissioned since the end of the Second World War, based on our 3 themes of why an individual wanted to commission, the selection route they followed, and the training they received. Interestingly, in terms of learning new information, just by publishing the call-in notice for this webinar has enabled us to learn that in 1977, the then Commandant, in a drive to increase the take-up of regular commissions, banned those seeking a short service commission from being awarded the Sword of Honour. Rather, they were to be eligible for a Commandant's coin, just the sort of information we are after. You will find a research briefing note in the handouts for this lecture, and as you will see, we are seeking recollections from across the spectrum of commissioning routes and locations, as well as from those who instructed or were academics at these establishments, regardless of rank or position. If you would like to support our research or just know more and are happy for us to contact you via the email you signed in with to tonight's webinar, please indicate yes on the question that Dudley has just published. If you are listening to the recording, please feel free to email us at the address on the screen, tsg16602025@gmail.com. And with that, we're happy to take questions. Dudley.
Brilliant, Simon. Thank you so much. Let me declare an interest here. 500 years of yeoman stock, mainly agricultural workers, brought up on a South London, that's South with 2 Fs, London council estate, went to a bog standard comprehensive school. I would never have got into the army in the days that you were describing so many years ago. Thank God for meritocracy. Okay. We've had lots of questions, and I don't think we'll have time to get through them all this evening, but we will have a stab at it. First question comes from Ethan. How much do corps such as the Royal Logistic Corps and the Signals value qualifications, and does your character take precedence?
I'll have a go at answering that, given that I spent 4 years at Westbury as a deputy president. For certain cap badges, you must have the qualification, but relevant that they require. But there are lots of people with qualifications. To be an army officer, you must be able to pass Westbury, which is a range of tests, of which character makes up one. We, Vic and I, contest it is probably one of the most important ones. But regardless of your qualifications and regardless of what cap badge you want to go to, you must pass Westbury first, which is a generic test. And there is no element of it that says, oh, this person can pass because they only want to go to the infantry, or they want, oh, this person can't pass because they didn't get high enough on this. You either pass or fail against the standard for a generic army officer ready to, capable of receiving the training to lead 30 men and women. You do not pass or fail based on your qualifications. That's probably enough on that one, and we can move on.
Thank you. Jason asks, the mix between graduate and non-graduate candidates. The Army does not need an officer corps of generals, but a mix of knapsack wallers and those who are only in for a few years. How does this mix with current demands for degree education within the officer corps?
Stunned silence from Vic, so I guess I'm on again. No, the Army does not need all generals. But even at the very bottom end, and even in the infantry and the armoured corps now, much greater emphasis is placed on the use of technology, and therefore a highly educated officer corps is what's needed. It's not about whether you did a degree in Latin or archaeology, or you actually have a science degree. It's about your ability to understand and think at that level so that you can operate and make best use of the equipment that are available for you. You can be as bright as you like, you can have all the educations. You might then realise after 3 years the Army's not for you, which is fine. But you don't necessarily need, it's probably highly unlikely that any general didn't have a first degree in the current Army. I can't say for certain. But there are routes open for those without degrees. You can get an in-service degree and therefore, and an in-service MA. So, and Santos now gives you a degree as you go through it if you don't have one, so long as you're prepared to do the extra work. So it's all there, and the Army does need an intelligent, capable, and proactive and flexible officer corps.
Alexander poses a question from the Army Multicultural Network. Never heard of that. Do you think there is a risk of bias and discrimination in the bars and wider officer selection? And could this be related to the lack of diversity in the officer cadre? And before you answer the question, can you please explain the acronym BARS, B-A-R-S?
So Simon mentioned it in his part of the talk tonight, that it's behaviourally anchored.
Go on, Vic, keep going.
No, I'm sharing it with you. Behaviourally anchored.
God, I hate this. Rating score.
And Simon worked for many a long year at Westbury and was part of this entire process of selection. So I think he's responded to a couple of comments about selection. So let me explain something that I observed when I went to Westbury as an observer. So Simon and I got into this research some years ago because I was doing an MA, and the MA was about officer selection and comparing it to officer selection in the other services. So I was allowed to go after I had already commissioned back to Westbury as an observer. And I was completely shocked because when you're there as an individual being assessed, it all happens so quickly and you're so focused on the activities and doing a good job. And you know, there's so much to think about when you're there that you haven't really got time to think about what the assessors are doing. When you go as an observer, it is very clear that the assessors are extremely well trained. There is an exceptional amount of consistency across what they do, that they're consistently working hard in the background to record the information that they observe. Sorry, Simon, could you just pop yourself on mute for a sec? And so I would honestly say that I can't comment on what's happened before, but I can comment on what I've seen in the last couple of years, which is that there is very little opportunity for bias and discrimination. The way that it operates now. There's so many layers of moderation, and coming from an education background, I can tell you that that is really tricky to achieve and accomplish in an organization where you might have 7 or 8 people doing an assessment. So I'm not just saying this, I'm saying it from a genuine perspective, that I feel that there's very little chance of that happening. Simon can add his 2 penny worth in a moment, but I think the lack of diversity in the officer cadre is a much more complicated topic, because it's to do with all kinds of different things. And again, the research that I did, which ended up being part of the Haythornthwaite review, exemplifies that there is a very complicated situation where people are trying to recruit from diverse backgrounds, but that is nothing, that's not representative of what goes on when you're actually at Westbury. Simon.
Just for people who are, I recognise some people have joined this so they can learn the inside tricks of Westbury. I'm not going to tell you any tricks, because that's my deal with the army, to be able to write about it without giving away the tricks. But what I will say is there are 3 primary assessors, and throughout the 3.5 days, we do not talk to each other about any one individual. We might talk about process, we might talk about what task an individual might get, but it's done in such a way that no information about that individual is passed out. And Vic's observed that taking place, had it done to herself and observed it when she came. And so it's not until the final boarding, when all the candidates are rushing to get in their cars or get to the Westbury station and go home, that we sit down and start to discover what each of us has thought. And it's also driven bottom up. So the most junior person in the room, the captain that is the group leader, gives their opinion first. I, the deputy president, then give my opinion. And the third person to give their opinion is the vice president. And that collective opinion. So there's no swaying of like, I'm subordinate to the vice president and they said X is a good bloke or good lady. And me going, oh yeah, I'll just agree with that. I say what I think. So does the group leader, before anyone else has a chance to sway them. And interesting, as a diversion, that's exactly how court martials are run, so that there is no chain of command drive down to make the answer happen that the top person wants. That's probably enough. Let's get another question.
This one comes from Bruce. Even today, the various arms and corps of the British Army demonstrate different characteristics and continue to select officers from Sandhurst according to their own priorities. To what extent is the character required of a generic British Army officer different from that character that most suits an individual to a specific regiment? And should we differentiate?
I'll start with this, Simon, because what I'll do is draw an analogy to how I recruit, and then Simon can give you his army perspective. So when I recruit teachers for the school at which I am the head teacher, all of them are equally qualified. We send out the job specification, which for the army officer, as we said earlier, is obviously the commission, even though perhaps most people don't realise that. So the job description goes out and people apply for the role based on the job description and the skills that we would like. And it's the same for army officers. They've all been through this rigorous recruitment process, and there they are at Sandhurst. So the bit that is perhaps a bit more subjective, for want of a better word, is the bit where the corps or the regiment will go and have a chat with various people who are keen to join them. And at that point, similarly to when I recruit people, I'm looking for best fit. I'm looking for people who will come in and complement the team that we have already established, who have got either a complementary skill set. So we think we haven't got this currently in our team. So this person offers me not just the qualification of which everybody is equally qualified, but they also offer something in terms of additionality that they can bring to my organisation. And I suspect, although I don't know for certain, because I'm not a CO and I'm not an OC, and I'm not really a person that's part of that selection process, but I suspect it could be something similar to that. Over to you, Simon.
I think if you remember, almost in our conclusion slide, I said that the army is a very traditional organisation made up of, if you like, lots of tribes. And if you were to take Scottish tribes, you would probably find that 2 people with different Mac surnames are not suitable to be with each other because they are from different, if you like, tribes. And it's that fit. Who is the right fit for that particular regiment at that time? Where does the regiment see it going? How does it see its future officers, and what does it want for them? We could wax lyrical of probably from all the people who served about stories of different people trying for different regiments. But ultimately, it's about whether you will be, they are just as concerned that you, the individual trying to join a particular cap badge, is as comfortable with them as they are with you. Otherwise, if you're uncomfortable, you have made the wrong choice. They've helped you make that wrong choice, and it serves neither you, their cap badge, nor the army any use whatsoever. Next question, I think.
I'll just add to that, as an officer that went to Sandhurst to select officers from that location for the Royal Military Police on a number of occasions. I echo Vic's words about looking for best fit. You know these people are going to be good army officers because that's what they've been selected and trained to be. Now you're trying to see whether they will fit in with your organisation. Let's go a bit historical here. From Rohan, our treasurer. In the 20th century, many public schools had combined cadet forces. To what extent did this affect the preference for ex-public school boys? And how far back does the CCF go?
Shall I go for it, Vic?
Yeah.
Okay, 1859, there was a scare in Britain that the French were going to invade. And as a result, there was a vast groundswell of volunteer movements. People did not want to join the militia. It did exist, if you like, as the Home Defence Reserve. But people didn't want to do that. There is this idea of, in Victorian Britain, of volunteering. Volunteering battalions were set up in towns, in countrysides, universities set them up, and also many of the public schools chose to set up volunteer cadet corps. These then carried on in various guises, sometimes affiliated to the local volunteer battalion, sometimes they formed a company within it. And these carried on until, in effect, 1809, when Haldane reorganised the volunteer movements and the militia into the territorial force. And at this time, he created the Officer Training Corps, Junior Division, public school boys, Senior Division, university men. Public school boys could complete a Certificate A, and that meant you'd received a certain amount of military training, done a certain number of military camps, and likewise a university chap could receive a Certificate B. Holding those effectively enabled you on the outbreak of the First World War to gain a commission. For many, even just having been in, very quickly, many got the commission even having just been in the cadet corps. Most of the cadet corps swelled during the First World War in the first couple of years to being almost 100% of all pupils in their schools were members of them. They continued after the Second World War as the junior and senior divisions of the Officer Cadet Corps, and then after up until the Second World War, doing very much the same thing. After the Second World War, it was decided to reorganize them as the combined cadet force and enable them to have maritime and air sections as well, to provide a reserve for all three services rather than just primarily for the army. Hopefully that answers your question, Rowan.
Yeah, hold on a second. I wanted to go back to a point someone else made. Yeah, it's on that point. Ian's made an observation. It's not a question. I would not denigrate the militia back door with two field marshals, John French and Henry Wilson, emerging from it, and if memory serves, Henderson of the Royal Flying Corps. To which I would only say, Ian, are those three officers there to support or take away from your argument? Anyway, I will move on.
Well, we can also add Trenchard as well.
Yeah, I was going to say Trenchard, but I wasn't absolutely certain in my knowledge there. Okay, Mark, once again, we're going back to the historical part of your talk. I wonder if you could say something about the hierarchical model reflected in the 18th century selection of officers. Selecting officers from the landed gentry and aristocracy was not just about a concept of character, but was also an expression of the idea that these were the natural leaders of that society, that the system was not just exclusionary, but also organic, ensuring that the army reflected the society that produced it. Can you comment?
I think we agree. I think the main thread of tonight's talk is in agreement with that, really. It did reinforce those societal expectations because the army was produced from and within the society that it existed to serve. So of course it embodied the kind of prevailing views of the day. Our talk tonight was mainly about character, but that's not to say that people were selected. It was just to highlight the fact that this notion of character was threaded throughout the aristocracy and gentry. Would you agree, Simon?
Yeah, absolutely nothing further to add from this call sign.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, but people have gone to the trouble of asking these questions.
Yeah.
So if you're happy to stay with us, we'll plow through them. Plow probably not being the best adjective to use, but nevertheless. Tim has observed, you have spoken a lot about the moral and ethical. Bill Slim wrote in his book, Defeating to Victory, that morale has a spiritual as much as an intellectual or material base. And Montgomery argued well over 60 years ago that I do not believe that a commander can inspire great armies or single units or even individual men unless he has a proper sense of religious truth. All leadership is based on the spiritual quality, the power to inspire others to follow. Did your analysis look at this?
I'll take that. No, what we're for our main area of research is looking at how we get the officers. We of course look at the commissioning of chaplains and continue to follow that through, be they regimental chaplains or the formation of the chaplains department in 1794 and on into the modern era. And so we do recognise that there is a spiritual element and there is a need for it, if you like, because the army selects these people and employs them. But we're not looking so much at leadership in our book, but rather how we obtain those leaders and what criteria are used to select them.
An interesting question for Phil Watson. Did you look at the religious balance given the Catholic exodus to Europe in the 1600s?
We did. To sum it up, buy the book. When it's out, buy the book. We did. And also to go back to the previous question, I find the concept of spirituality really interesting, and padres and spiritual representation and so on, just a fascinating concept. And so much so that I did write a blog post, which is on Modnet. But it's not kind of the main foregrounded piece of work that we've done. Similarly, the religious balance, it informs the people who were recruited and the state of play at various points in history. But it isn't the main thrust of our book. We do look at it, but it's not the main thrust.
If I just look at the Catholic piece, we absolutely look at the Catholic versus Protestant piece. Of course, you have to if you are starting with the standing army in 1660. We look at the Test Act, and we talk about the impact and the sort of almost like the era in the American forces in the 1990s under Bill Clinton it was the sort of don't ask era. Don't answer the question that you're a Catholic and we'll let you have a commission. If you say you're a Catholic, you won't get a commission. Just ignore the question. And there were times when the British Army needed, or the armies of Britain needed those men, and it was therefore very happily overlooked. Of course, it's not an issue in the current army.
Richard has made an observation about Royal Allen Company. I think it's a shame that Royal Allen Company was disbanded. I think it probably delivered some quality officers that would otherwise have been lost. And Richard says, I say this as a survivor. I remember Royal Allen being brought in. Would you like to comment on the question?
Go on, Simon.
I seem to be answering a lot.
Passionately about this.
No, Royal Allen, for a lot of its time, was of its time. As you say, you were a survivor, and therefore I suspect you empathise with that comment. Interestingly enough, there was in about, I'm trying to think, 2017, there was a very low throughput going through Sandhurst. Basically, it wasn't a Westbury problem. It was a problem that we weren't recruiting because the hopper wasn't being filled. Therefore, we didn't have enough to select and what was going. So the commandant at the time, Major General Paul Nansen, actually ended up with a spare company's worth of instructors because there weren't enough cadets there to fill it. So he recreated a thing called the Leadership Development Course. Roe Allen, perhaps by another name, who knows. It ran for about 3 years. We were managing to fill the hopper, and it was disbanded because he needed the officers, the instructors back to run his companies. I do agree that there are some people who come through Westbury who if given added value by somewhere and come back will be successful and then go on and be successful at Sandhurst. Whether it is the Army's job to give them that added value, or whether it is a case of telling them to go away and find it for themselves and seeing if they have the determination to do that and the wherewithal to improve themselves, who knows? So it's not. It's not one I have a very strong view about whether we should or shouldn't have a Roe Allen company, but I do agree there is the perennial problem of what to do with what, if you might like call them, the not yet ready to pass Westbury, but has the potential to do so. Do you leave it to their own devices? Do you not? Many candidates who come through Westbury are aged 19, maybe 20 in their first year at university, with so many being university graduates now. So they have a couple of years at university where they can join the UHEC or go and join any one of a number of activities in order to broaden themselves, mature themselves, get physically fit, whatever it is was their area to work on, and then come back for their second attempt. So whether it's for the Army to do it or whether it's for the individual, who knows?
Okay, I do think probably now is a good time to draw stumps. Before I do so, we've managed to retain half of the audience for the question and answer session, which just goes to show what an interesting talk it was this evening, and how much it has engendered quite a lively debate, I think. Our next talk is on the 21st of October. Lucy Betteridge Dyson is going to talk about the experience of the commandos in the Arakan campaign, dear to her heart because her grandfather served in 3 Commando during that campaign. I know Lucy well. I know that she will deliver to us an excellent talk. If you'd like to register this evening, please do. I've just put up the link there. But now all it remains for me to do is to thank on the Society's behalf, and you, the remaining of the audience, to Vic Carr and Simon Shephard for what was a really illuminating and interesting talk this evening. Simon upheld his bargain with the Army by not giving away any tips on how to pass RCB, or whatever we call it nowadays. I am going to leave this presentation now, go downstairs and read my commissioning scroll, which I don't think I've read for a long, long time, just to remind myself of what it says. But on behalf of the Society and me personally, Vic, Simon, it's been a delight this evening. Thank you very much indeed for the talk. And I'm going to end the session now. Good night.
Thanks for having us. Good night.